At 6:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944, the most powerful fortress in human history began to die. Along the beaches of Normandy, thousands of American, British, and Canadian soldiers waded through chest-deep water toward a wall of concrete and steel that had consumed 17 million cubic meters of concrete, 1.2 million tons of steel, and 3.7 billion Reichsmarks for the French portion alone. Nearly 4 years of construction. Approximately 2,000 miles of fortifications stretching from the Arctic shores of Norway to the Spanish border. German propaganda had called it impregnable. Adolf Hitler had declared himself the greatest builder of fortifications of all time. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the man charged with defending it, had called it something else entirely, a gigantic bluff. Within 24 hours, 150,000 Allied soldiers would stand on French soil. The Atlantic Wall, the most expensive defensive construction project in modern military history, would be breached along a 50-mile front, and the German commanders who had staked everything on concrete and steel would learn a devastating lesson about the nature of modern warfare. This is the story of 3 fatal mistakes that doomed Hitler's fortress Europe before the first Allied soldier ever touched the sand. The Atlantic Wall was born not from strength, but from desperation. In the summer of 1940, fresh from their stunning victory over France, German forces began constructing coastal batteries at key ports along the English Channel. These early fortifications were modest affairs, designed primarily to protect submarine bases and prevent commando raids. But as the war dragged on, as Operation Barbarossa ground to a bloody stalemate in the Soviet Union, and as American industrial might began pouring across the Atlantic, Hitler recognized an uncomfortable truth. Germany could not fight a two-front war indefinitely. Concrete would have to substitute for manpower. On March 23, 1942, Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 40. This document ordered the transformation of Western Europe's entire coastline into a continuous defensive barrier. The scale was staggering. From the North Cape of Norway, around the coasts of Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, all the way to the Pyrenees Mountains on the Spanish border, approximately 2,000 miles of fortifications, 15,000 individual defensive positions. An undertaking that would dwarf every previous military construction project in history. The task fell to the organization TOT, a civil and military engineering group originally founded to build the German highway system and the Siegfried Line along the French border. After the mysterious death of Fritz Todt in a plane explosion at Rastenburg on February 8, 1942, Albert Speer assumed nominal control of the organization, but day-to-day operations were managed by his deputy, Franz Xaver Dorsch. At peak mobilization, approximately 300,000 laborers worked simultaneously on the Atlantic Wall. This was not a workforce of willing volunteers. It was a multinational army of the desperate and the condemned. French civilians conscripted under the Service du Travail Obligatoire, Soviet prisoners of war who had already survived the death marches from the Eastern Front, Polish forced laborers, North African workers, Indo-Chinese brought from the other side of the world, Belgian Jews, roughly 40,000 Spanish Republican exiles who had fled Franco only to find themselves building fortifications for another fascist regime. Only about 10% of the workers were German. The human cost of this construction was immense. Workers were organized into brigades and shipped to construction sites across occupied Europe. They lived in barracks, often former factories or warehouses, sleeping on wooden bunks with minimal bedding. Food rations were calculated to provide just enough calories to keep men working, nothing more. The conditions were brutal. Workers toiled 12-hour shifts in all weather conditions. Concrete had to be poured continuously or it would set improperly. Accidents were common. Medical care was minimal. Those who collapsed from exhaustion or illness were often simply replaced. The exact death toll among Organization TOT workers will never be known, but historians estimate it numbered in the tens of thousands. The Dieppe raid of August 19, 1942 paradoxically accelerated construction. When 6,000 Canadian and British commandos launched a frontal assault on the fortified port of Dieppe, they were cut to pieces. Nearly 60% became casualties. Over 900 were killed. The raid was a military disaster for the Allies, but it gave Hitler the proof he needed that his fortress concept could work. He ordered 15,000 defensive positions completed by May 1943. Organization TOT engineers told him only 40% was achievable. Monthly concrete pouring surged from roughly 50,000 cubic meters in March 1942 to 780,000 cubic meters by April 1943, a 15-fold increase in just 13 months. Yet even this frantic pace could not cover 2,000 miles. By the end of 1943, only 8,000 of the planned 15,000 structures had been completed, 53% of the target, and those structures were not distributed evenly. The heaviest fortifications clustered around two priorities that would prove strategically disastrous: the Pas-de-Calais region, where the English Channel was narrowest at just 21 miles, and the major port cities that the Allies would need to sustain any invasion force. Normandy, where the invasion would actually come, remained a secondary concern. Then came Erwin Rommel. In November 1943, Hitler appointed the Desert Fox as Inspector of Coastal Defences. Rommel had earned his legendary reputation fighting the British in North Africa, where he had learned harsh lessons about Allied air power. He completed a 2-week inspection tour of the Atlantic Wall that left him appalled. The fortifications he found were incomplete, poorly positioned, and in many sectors barely existent. In some areas, bunkers had been built without regard to fields of fire. Artillery batteries lacked sufficient ammunition stores. Minefields existed on paper but had never been laid. Beach obstacles that should have been in place for years remained in warehouses or had never been manufactured at all. He wrote to his wife Lucy that the wall was a figment of Hitler's cloud cuckoo land. In German, Wolkenkuckucksheim. A fantasy disconnected from military reality, Rommel threw himself into improving the defences with characteristic energy. In just 5 months, from January to May 1944, he drove the construction of 4,600 additional hardened fortifications. He laid 6 million landmines along the beaches and coastal approaches. He erected 517,000 foreshore obstacles, with 31,000 of them fitted with telemines and other explosives. He planted over 1 million wooden poles in the fields behind the beaches, obstacles designed to destroy Allied gliders attempting to land airborne troops. The soldiers called them Rommel asparagus. One academic study concluded that Rommel accomplished more in 5 months than had been built in the preceding 3.5 years combined. But it was not enough. Rommel had wanted 50 million mines. He got barely 6 million, roughly 12% of his request. Construction in the Normandy sector remained only 18% complete in critical areas. 3 of the 6 planned rows of beach obstacles were never installed. The resources simply did not exist. The Atlantic Wall's standardized construction system, designated the Regelbau program, encompassed over 250 different bunker types, from massive naval gun casemates capable of engaging battleships to small Tobruk machine gun pits designed for a single soldier. Walls and roofs ranged from 30 centimeters thick for field-type positions to 3.5 meters thick for permanent installations designed to withstand direct hits from naval guns. The statistics were impressive on paper. Thousands of bunkers, hundreds of gun batteries, millions of mines. But the reality was far less formidable. The wall was never actually a wall. It was a thin line of defensive positions, sometimes separated by miles of undefended coastline. Behind that line was nothing, no depth, no reserves, no secondary positions to fall back to if the first line failed. General Gunther Blumentritt, von Rundstedt's chief of staff, described it accurately. A line, a chain of individual works without depth. If the enemy penetrated to a depth of 1 kilometer, they would be in free terrain. The men who would defend this fortress were not Germany's finest. By 1944, the cream of the Wehrmacht was bleeding out on the Eastern Front. The divisions assigned to France were a mix of recovering units, training formations, and garrison troops considered unsuitable for the Russian front. Many were classified as static divisions, meaning they lacked the transport to move and were expected to fight and die in place. Some units were even more unusual. The Ostlegionen, or Eastern Legions, were formations composed of former Soviet prisoners of war who had been given the choice between fighting for Germany or starving in prisoner-of-war camps, Georgians. Azerbaijanis, Ukrainians, Turkestanis, men who often spoke no German, had no particular loyalty to the Nazi cause, and whose reliability in combat was questionable at best. At Omaha Beach, elements of the 709th Static Infantry Division defended the sector. This division included the 795th Georgian Battalion, attached to the 739th Grenadier Regiment, one of several Ostlegionen units comprising roughly a quarter of the division's strength. These conscripted Georgians and other former Soviet soldiers would face the American 4th Infantry Division on the morning of June 6. The officers and senior non-commissioned officers were mostly German, many of them veterans of earlier campaigns who had been wounded or were considered too old for frontline service in the East. They did their best to train their polyglot commands, to instill discipline and fighting spirit, but they harbored few illusions about their prospects against elite Allied assault troops backed by overwhelming air and naval superiority. The daily routine of garrison duty in France was a strange mixture of tedium and anxiety. The men maintained their positions, conducted endless drills, and waited. They could see the massive Allied build-up across the Channel through reconnaissance reports. They knew the invasion was coming. They simply did not know when or where. In early June 1944, the weather over the English Channel turned foul. German meteorologists, who had lost access to weather stations in the Atlantic when they lost control of the seas, predicted 2 weeks of storms. Invasion conditions would be impossible. This assessment was wrong. June 5, 1944. The day before the world changed. Along the coast of Normandy, German soldiers went about their routines with no particular sense of urgency. The weather was miserable. Rain squalls swept across the beaches. The Channel was rough and grey. No invasion force could possibly cross in such conditions. Field Marshal Rommel was not at his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon. He was 800 kilometers away in Hurlingen, Germany, where he had gone for his wife Lucy Maria's 50th birthday. He carried grey suede shoes he had bought for her in Paris as a gift. He also planned to meet with Hitler to once again request additional Panzer divisions for the coastal defence. General Friedrich Dollmann, commanding the 7th Army responsible for Normandy, had scheduled a Kriegsspiel for the morning of June 6, a war game. Ironically, the exercise was designed to simulate an Allied landing in Normandy. Approximately 50% of his division commanders and 25% of his regimental commanders had travelled to Rennes for this conference. They would not be with their units when the invasion began. General Wilhelm Falley of the 91st Air Landing Division was among those who left his headquarters that night. He would be ambushed and killed by American paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division while racing back to his command post in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6. He became the first German general to die in the Normandy campaign. The weather gave everyone a false sense of security. Even the most vigilant German officers assumed they had at least 2 more weeks before they needed to worry about an invasion. What they did not know was that Royal Air Force Group Captain James Stagg had identified a brief 36-hour window of acceptable weather. General Dwight Eisenhower had made the most consequential decision of the war. The invasion, postponed from June 5 due to the storms, would proceed on June 6. Across the Channel, over 150,000 men were loading onto ships and aircraft. 6,000 vessels were assembling into the largest armada in human history. 11,000 aircraft were preparing for the greatest air operation ever attempted. And the Germans, blinded by their own meteorological limitations, suspected nothing. The parachutes began falling after midnight. Shortly after 12:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944, pathfinders from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions began dropping into the darkness over the Cotentin Peninsula. Minutes later, British paratroopers of the 6th Airborne Division landed east of the Orne River to secure the crucial Pegasus Bridge. German sentries reported parachutes, then more parachutes, then gliders. The reports were confused and contradictory. Some officers dismissed them as commandos or supply drops. Others recognized the scale of what was happening but could not believe their own eyes. At Field Marshal von Rundstedt's headquarters at Saint-Germain-en-Laye near Paris, staff officers received the first reports with skepticism. An airborne landing of this size was unprecedented. It could be a diversion, a feint designed to draw German reserves away from the real landing site. Von Rundstedt was not fooled. He recognized immediately that this was the main invasion and that it was coming in Normandy. At dawn, he made a fateful decision. He ordered the 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division to move immediately toward the beachhead. He did not have the authority to give this order. This was the first of the three mistakes that would doom the Atlantic Wall: the command structure. Adolf Hitler had retained personal control over the panzer reserves. No armoured division could move without his explicit approval. This arrangement reflected what historians have described as the growing megalomania of the Führer. It also meant that the only force capable of throwing the invasion back into the sea was frozen in place, waiting for permission from a man who was still asleep. No fewer than 7 overlapping chains of authority governed Western defense. The Armed Forces High Command under Keitel and Hodel, Oberbefehlshaber West under von Rundstedt, Army Group B under Rommel, Army Group G under Blaskowitz, Panzer Group West under Gerd von Schweppenberg, Luftflotte 3 under Spurler, and Navy Group West under Kranke. The Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine operated independently. Von Rundstedt could issue them directives only, not direct orders. The organization took its own decisions on what to build and where, without consulting the military units that would fight from its structures. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations at the Armed Forces High Command, received von Rundstedt's request at approximately 6 in the morning. He refused to wake Hitler. The Führer had taken sleeping pills the previous evening and had given standing orders not to be disturbed. Hitler did not rise until approximately 10 in the morning. Even after being informed of the invasion, he did not immediately release the panzers. He attended a reception for the Hungarian Prime Minister in Salzburg. He discussed the situation with his advisors. He hesitated. The armoured reserves were finally released sometime between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, more than 12 hours after the first Allied troops had hit the beaches. The 21st Panzer Division illustrated the paralysis in microcosm. This was the only armoured unit within striking distance of the invasion beaches, positioned just 20 miles from the coast near Caen. Its commander, General Edgar Feutinger, was absent from his post when the invasion began. The division needed clearance from Hitler's headquarters to move because it was part of the armoured reserve. Corps Commander General Erich Marx did not receive authority over the 21st Panzer until noon. The division then had to backtrack through the bottleneck at Caen, crossing damaged bridges under naval bombardment. A 10-mile move consumed 3 hours. The counterattack finally launched at 4 in the afternoon. The 1st Battalion of the 192nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment actually reached the sea at Lyon-sur-Mer, momentarily splitting the British beachhead between Sword and Juno beaches. It was the only German unit to reach the water on D-Day. But the battalion found itself alone, unsupported, and taking fire from both flanks. When 246 British gliders appeared overhead at 9 in the evening, bringing reinforcements to the 6th Airborne Division, the Germans withdrew. The 21st Panzer Division suffered heavy tank losses, with some accounts reporting as few as 54 operational tanks remaining by nightfall. The opportunity to defeat the invasion in detail was gone. Major Hans von Luck of the 21st Panzer Division captured the frustration of the German commanders that day. The clearance for an immediate night attack, so as to take advantage of the initial confusion among our opponents, had still not come. The 12th SS Hitler Jugend Division did not begin moving from Lisieux until 5 in the afternoon. It arrived piecemeal on June 7, too late to affect the outcome of D-Day. Panzer Lehr, one of the elite formations of the German armoured forces, did not reach the front until June 9. During the approach march, Allied aircraft caught the division in the open. It lost approximately 90 armoured vehicles and 130 trucks before firing a single shot at the enemy. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich received orders to move from Montauban in southern France on June 7. It began its march north the following day, but the journey that should have taken 3 days stretched into weeks. French resistance attacks and Allied airstrikes harassed the division along every route of advance. The division committed the massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane on June 10, while still far from the battlefield. Its advance elements did not reach Normandy until mid-June, and the full division was not assembled until late in the month. On the beaches themselves, the Atlantic Wall was dying. At Utah Beach, strong currents pushed the American landing craft 2,000 yards south of the designated zone. This navigational error proved fortunate. The sector where they actually landed was less heavily defended than their intended target. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., son of the former president and the only general to land with the first wave, made a decision that became legend. "We will start the war from here." The defenders at Utah included elements of the 709th Static Infantry Division, with its mix of German regulars and attached Ostlegionen battalions. Facing the overwhelming firepower and professional assault of the American 4th Infantry Division, resistance crumbled quickly. American casualties at Utah numbered just 197 among 21,000 troops landed. All 3 beach exits were secured within 3 hours. The vaunted Atlantic Wall had failed utterly in this sector. Omaha Beach was different. The 352nd Infantry Division defended this sector. 12,020 men, including 6,800 veterans of the Eastern Front. Field Marshal Rommel had personally ordered this division moved into position on March 15, a fact that Allied intelligence had completely missed. 15 interconnected resistance nests created interlocking fields of fire across a natural killing zone. The beach was a crescent of sand backed by 30-meter bluffs with only 5 narrow ravine exits. Any attacker would have to cross hundreds of meters of open beach under fire before reaching even minimal cover. Low cloud caused the pre-assault bombing to miss the beach entirely. 27 of 32 amphibious tanks in one battalion sank before reaching shore, their flotation screens overwhelmed by the rough seas. The specialized armor that was supposed to suppress the German defenses lay at the bottom of the English Channel. The Americans suffered approximately 2,400 casualties at Omaha Beach, somewhere around 770 killed. General Omar Bradley on the cruiser USS Augusta briefly considered evacuating the beach entirely. For several desperate hours, it seemed the Atlantic Wall might actually succeed in one sector. The carnage at Omaha became the defining image of D-Day. Landing craft ramps dropped and men fell before they could take a single step forward. Bodies bobbed in the surf. The wounded drowned when the tide came in. Surviving soldiers huddled behind the seawall and the beach obstacles, unable to advance, unable to retreat, watching their comrades die around them. Yet even at Omaha, the Atlantic Wall ultimately failed. The 352nd Division had no reserves. Its commander, General Lieutenant Dietrich Kreis, had positioned his men well, but he had nothing left to commit once the battle began. When he sent his remaining troops against Gold Beach to his right to prevent the British from flanking Omaha, he left gaps in his line. The German defenders had fought with discipline and courage. They had turned the beach into a killing field, but they could not sustain the defense without reinforcement. By mid-morning, their ammunition was running low. Machine gun barrels overheated and had to be replaced. Communications between strongpoints broke down as naval gunfire severed telephone lines. Small groups of American soldiers infiltrated between the strongpoints and began scaling the bluffs. Led by officers and sergeants who rallied the survivors with desperate courage, they found the gaps that Kreis had been forced to leave. By evening, they had established a precarious but sustainable toehold. At Gold Beach, British forces landed at 7:25 in the morning. Cruisers HMS Ajax and HMS Argonaut neutralized 3 of 4 gun emplacements at Long-sur-Mer with naval gunfire. The Le Hamel strongpoint held until 4 in the afternoon, but could not stop 25,000 troops from advancing 6 miles inland. At Juno Beach, Canadian forces faced the 716th Infantry Division. 30% of landing craft struck mines, and nearly half of Canadian casualties occurred in the first hour of the assault. Despite this, the Canadians achieved the deepest Allied penetration on D-Day, reaching nearly to Carpiquet Airfield, southwest of Caen. At Sword Beach, 33 of 40 amphibious tanks made shore successfully, providing armoured support that overwhelmed the understrength 716th Division. The Hillman strongpoint held until 8:15 in the evening and blocked the advance on Caen, which would not fall until mid-July. But the beachhead was secure. The Luftwaffe's contribution to the defence was effectively symbolic. Against 14,674 Allied sorties on June 6, the German Air Force managed roughly 320 sorties. The most famous German air response over the actual beaches consisted of a strafing run by two Focke-Wulf 190s flown by Fighter Wing 26, Commander Josef Priller, and his wingman Sergeant Heinz Włodarczyk. The Kriegsmarine fared no better. Only 3 German torpedo boats engaged the Eastern Task Force, sinking the Norwegian destroyer Svena but achieving nothing else of significance. German naval forces had been so depleted by years of attrition that they could offer no meaningful resistance to an invasion fleet of nearly 7,000 vessels. The contrast in naval power was overwhelming. The Allied bombardment fleet included 7 battleships, 23 cruisers, and over 80 destroyers. Their guns could reach miles inland, devastating any German attempt to move reinforcements during daylight hours. The battleship USS Nevada, resurrected from the mud of Pearl Harbor, pounded German positions with her 14-inch guns. The venerable British battleships Warspite and Ramillies added their firepower to the assault. German coastal batteries, the pride of the Atlantic Wall, proved largely ineffective against this armada. Many had been positioned to engage an invasion fleet at sea, but the Allies came in under cover of darkness and established themselves before the batteries could respond. Others were neutralized by naval gunfire before they could fire more than a few salvos. The massive guns that Hitler had boasted about were silenced one by one. By nightfall on June 6, approximately 150,000 Allied soldiers were ashore. 10,000 had become casualties, including approximately 4,400 dead. German losses were estimated between 4,000 and 9,000. The Atlantic Wall, that 17 million cubic meters of concrete, that 1.2 million tons of steel, had been breached in a single day. The second mistake had ensured that German reinforcements would arrive too late to matter. Operation Fortitude was the codename for one of history's greatest deception operations. Its success depended on a German intelligence apparatus that was compromised at nearly every level. The scheme had 2 components. Fortitude North simulated a fictional British Fourth Army in Scotland, threatening an invasion of Norway. Fortitude South created the Phantom 1st United States Army Group, 11 non-existent divisions comprising roughly 150,000 imaginary soldiers. This ghost army was notionally commanded by General George Patton from headquarters at Wentworth near Ascot. The physical apparatus was elaborate. 255 dummy landing craft built from steel tubes and canvas floated in Folkestone Harbour. Inflatable rubber Sherman tanks were repositioned nightly to simulate unit movements. Fake army camps with empty tents were constructed by set builders from Shepperton Studios. Plywood aircraft sat on dummy airfields across Kent and Essex. The United States 3,103rd Signal Battalion generated radio traffic equivalent to a massive army forming in southeast England. Genuine 21st Army Group messages were routed to Kent via landline before broadcast, making them appear to originate in the region closest to Pas de Calais. The Allies even bombed the Calais area more heavily than Normandy to maintain the fiction. For every ton of bombs dropped on Normandy targets before D-Day, 2 tons fell on Pas de Calais. But the deception's true power flowed through double agents. Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spanish anti-fascist operating under the British codename Garbo, ran a network of 27 fictitious sub-agents and sent over 500 radio messages between January and June 1944. In the early hours of June 6, he transmitted a lengthy warning to his German handlers that the invasion was beginning, but his masterstroke came on June 9. The present attack on Normandy is a large-scale operation but diversionary in character, he reported. The constant aerial bombardment which the area of the Pas de Calais has suffered gives reason to suspect an attack in that region. German intelligence officer Colonel Friedrich Adolf Krummacher annotated the report in red ink. Confirms the view already held by us that a further attack is to be expected in another place. The message reached Jodl, then Hitler. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel telephoned von Rundstedt at 7:30 in the morning on June 10. The order moving the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler to Normandy was cancelled. Those tanks, already on the road, were turned around and sent back to Pas de Calais to await an invasion that would never come. Polish double agent Roman Czerniawski, operating under the code name Brutus, reinforced the deception by reporting on June 8 that the Phantom Army Group remained intact and poised for the real invasion. Colonel Alexis von Roen, head of the German intelligence section for the Western Front and secretly an anti-Nazi monarchist, deliberately inflated 44 actual Allied divisions in Britain to 89 in his reports, giving the Phantom Army Group enormous credibility. The deception's architects had hoped for 14 days of continued deception after D-Day. They achieved approximately 7 weeks. Hitler kept 2 armoured divisions and 19 infantry divisions at Pas-de-Calais through July and August of 1944. Nearly 150,000 soldiers waiting in the wrong place for an attack that existed only in their imagination. The deception succeeded partly because the Abwehr, German military intelligence, was compromised from within. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, had become a determined opponent of the Nazi regime and systematically undermined German intelligence operations. He protected anti-Nazi elements within the organization and failed to root out the penetration of his spy networks. He was later implicated in the July 20th assassination plot against Hitler and executed in April 1945. Canaris never realized that every single German agent in Britain had been captured and turned by British intelligence through the double-cross system. The British Security Service, known as MI5, had established total control over German espionage in the United Kingdom. Every report that reached Berlin from agents in Britain was either fabricated or carefully edited to serve Allied purposes. Meanwhile, Allied air supremacy had eliminated German aerial reconnaissance over southern England. The last German aerial photographs of the build-up areas were taken on May 25, 1944, nearly 2 weeks before D-Day. The Germans were quite literally blind. Garbo was so trusted by his German handlers that 62 of his reports appeared in intelligence summaries given directly to Hitler. The Germans paid him $340,000 to maintain his fictitious network. He remains the only person in history to receive both the German Iron Cross, awarded on July 29, 1944 with Hitler's personal authorization, and the British MBE. The third mistake was doctrinal. A fundamental disagreement about how to use Germany's most powerful weapon, the Panzer divisions. Field Marshal von Rundstedt advocated a traditional mobile defense. Allow the enemy to land. Determine the invasion's focal point. Then crush the beachhead with concentrated Panzer reserves striking from inland beyond the range of Allied naval guns. General Leo Gehr von Schweppenberg, commanding Panzer Group West, supported this approach. It was classic armoured warfare doctrine, the same approach that had delivered victory in France in 1940. Rommel's experience in North Africa had taught him the opposite lesson. He had seen what a numerically inferior Allied air force could do to armoured formations caught in the open. He had been nailed to the ground with 80,000 men for 2 or 3 days by constant air attack in the Western Desert. He knew conditions in France would be far worse. Allied air superiority over the Channel would be absolute. Any armoured formation attempting to move during daylight would be destroyed before it reached the battle. Rommel's strategy was simple: destroy the enemy at the waterline. If we cannot get at the enemy immediately after he lands, we will never be able to make another move, he warned. If we are not able to repulse the enemy at sea or throw him off the mainland in the first 24 hours, then the invasion will have succeeded and the war will be lost. Hitler imposed a compromise on March 21, 1944 that satisfied neither commander. 3 panzer divisions went to Rommel's Army Group B, but 2 of them were deployed in the Pas-de-Calais sector, leaving only the 21st Panzer Division near Caen to cover all of Normandy. 3 divisions went to Army Group G in southern France, too far away to influence any battle in the north. 4 divisions, including the critical 12th SS, Panzer Lehr, and 1st SS, were placed under direct Hitler reserve. Only the Führer himself could authorize their movement. In trying to make a limited resource go further than it could, the Germans had tied themselves into knots. Rommel had specifically requested that the 12th SS Panzer Division be moved from Évreux to Isigny, which would have placed it less than 10 miles from Omaha Beach instead of 110 miles to the east. Von Rundstedt, von Schweppenberg, and Guderian all refused. History proved Rommel right. The division arrived too late, weakened by air attack, and could only contain rather than destroy the Allied beachhead. When Rommel finally returned to his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon close to midnight on June 6, the decisive 24 hours he had predicted were over. He had received the first telephone call informing him of the invasion at approximately 10:15 in the morning, while still at his home in Hurlingen. His initial response, recorded by witnesses, was simply "How stupid of me." Rommel immediately began the long drive back to France, 800 kilometers of roads, through territory that was increasingly unsafe due to Allied air attacks. His staff car made the journey without incident, but the Field Marshal knew with every passing kilometer that the opportunity to throw the invasion back was slipping away. His stricken response upon learning the full situation at La Roche-Guyon was recorded by his staff. "If I was commander of the Allied forces right now, I could finish off the war in 14 days. Within 1 week, 500,000 Allied soldiers had landed in France." By the end of June, the number approached 850,000, with the 1 million mark reached in mid-July. The Mulberry artificial harbours, prefabricated port facilities towed across the channel in sections and assembled off the invasion beaches, allowed the Allies to land supplies without capturing a major port. These artificial harbours were an engineering marvel that the Germans had never anticipated. Mulberry A served the American sector at Omaha Beach. Mulberry B served the British at Arromanches. Together, they could handle the equivalent of a medium-sized port's capacity. When a severe storm on June 19 damaged Mulberry A beyond repair, the Allies simply increased operations through Mulberry B and began landing supplies directly onto the beaches using LSTs, the versatile landing ship tanks that could discharge vehicles straight onto the sand. The fortress strategy had assumed that any invasion force would need to capture a major port within days or face logistical collapse. The Mulberry harbours made that assumption catastrophically wrong. Cherbourg, designated by Hitler as a fortress to be held to the last man, fell on June 26 and 27 after a 4-day siege. German demolitions rendered the port unusable for weeks, but the fortress concept had failed utterly. The garrison could not be relieved or reinforced. It could only surrender or die. The Normandy breakout came with Operation Cobra on July 25. Massive carpet bombing west of St. Lo shattered the German defensive line. By July 30, Avranches fell. Patton's Third Army, the very formation the Germans had expected to lead the phantom invasion of Calais, poured through a 5-mile gap into the German rear. The Falaise pocket closed on August 21, trapping the remnants of 2 German armies in a cauldron of destruction. Between 10 and 15,000 German soldiers were killed within the pocket, and approximately 50,000 were captured. Allied fighter bombers circled overhead, destroying any vehicle that attempted to move during daylight. Artillery pounded the shrinking pocket from all sides. The roads inside the pocket became clogged with burning vehicles, dead horses, and the bodies of soldiers who had tried to escape. The stench of death carried for miles. Eisenhower later described the scene as one of the greatest killing fields of the war. Between 20 and 50,000 survivors managed to escape eastward toward the Seine, most without their heavy equipment. They crossed the river in anything that would float. Paris was liberated on August 25. Total German casualties in the Normandy campaign from June 6 to the end of August reached approximately 290,000, 23,000 killed, 67,000 wounded, over 200,000 missing or captured. 27 of 38 German divisions in Normandy were effectively destroyed as fighting formations. The southern portion of the Atlantic Wall fared no better. Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France, came on August 15, 1944. 94,000 men landed along the French Riviera between Toulon and Cannes. The fortifications that had been built along the Mediterranean coast proved even less effective than those in Normandy. Allied casualties on the first day numbered only 395. Within 2 weeks, the Allied forces had linked up with Patton's army advancing from Normandy, and all of southern France was liberated. The Atlantic Wall's ironic success came at the fortress ports that the Allies chose to bypass rather than assault. The Battle of Brest from August 25 to September 19, 1944 demonstrated why. 75,000 American troops required nearly a month and roughly 10,000 casualties to reduce a 37,000-man garrison. When Brest finally fell, the port was too demolished to use. After that expensive lesson, the Allies simply isolated the remaining fortress ports rather than assault them. Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Rochelle, and Dunkirk held out until Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945. Their garrisons, resupplied by submarine, waited out the war in positions that had become strategically irrelevant. The Channel Islands, which had absorbed 1/12 of all the Atlantic Wall's steel and concrete for propaganda purposes, surrendered on May 9, 1945. Their 28,500-man garrison had been completely bypassed by the war. The men who built and commanded the Atlantic Wall left a damning verdict on its effectiveness. Von Rundstedt called the fortifications sheer humbug. After the war, he told British military historian Basil Liddell Hart that one has only to look at it for oneself in Normandy to see what rubbish it was. Vice Admiral Friedrich Rouge, Rommel's naval advisor, wrote after the war that we were somewhat surprised when we could not find this wall. General Hans von Salmuth, commanding the 15th Army at Pas-de-Calais, had described the wall in autumn 1943 as a thin, in many places fragile, length of cord with a few small knots at isolated points. When General Heinz Guderian privately warned Hitler of the wall's weaknesses in January 1944, the Führer raged back. "I am the greatest builder of fortifications of all time." Rommel's pre-invasion warnings proved prophetic. On April 22, 1944, he told his aide, Captain Helmuth Lang, that the first 24 hours of the invasion would be decisive. For the Allies, as well as Germany, it will be the longest day. When Keitel called von Rundstedt on July 1st asking what they should do, the Field Marshal yelled back, "Make peace, you fools. What else can you do?" Hitler relieved him days later. Albert Speer, reflecting from Spandau prison after the war, was blunt about the enormous investment in the Atlantic Wall. All this expenditure of effort was sheer waste. The 1.2 million tons of steel consumed by the wall was enough to build more than 20,000 Tiger tanks. The concrete, the labor, the engineering expertise, all of it was poured into positions that could not move, could not adapt, and could not respond to battlefield conditions. Today, the ruins of the Atlantic Wall stretch along the beaches of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway. Concrete bunkers, too massive and too expensive to remove, stand as silent monuments to the war. Some have been preserved as museums. The battery at Lons-sur-Mer in Normandy, with its 4 150mm naval guns still in their casemates, receives thousands of visitors each year. The bunkers at Pointe du Hoc, where American Rangers scaled 100-foot cliffs under fire on D-Day, remain scarred by naval bombardment. Others have been reclaimed by nature. In Denmark, bunkers have slowly sunk into the sand dunes, emerging at odd angles like the bones of some ancient creature. Along the Dutch coast, graffiti artists have transformed grey concrete into canvases. In Norway, some bunkers have been converted into private homes, their thick walls providing excellent insulation against the Arctic cold. The organization Tot workforce left few memorials. The forced laborers who built these fortifications, the French civilians, the Soviet prisoners, the Spanish exiles, the Jewish workers, most of their names are lost to history. They died in construction accidents, from disease, from malnutrition, from the casual brutality of their overseers. Their sacrifice is commemorated primarily in academic studies and memorial plaques that most tourists never notice. The Atlantic Wall's 3 fatal mistakes were not isolated errors. They were interlocking failures that compounded one another. The divided command structure meant that even correct decisions could not be executed in time. Von Rundstedt recognized the invasion for what it was. He ordered the appropriate response, but his orders were countermanded by staff officers afraid to wake their leader. The intelligence catastrophe meant that Germany's strongest forces were aimed at the wrong target. The 15th Army at Pas-de-Calais, the best equipped and most powerful German force in the West, sat idle for 7 weeks while Normandy fell. Even after D-Day, Hitler remained convinced that Normandy was a feint. The doctrinal compromise over Panzer placement ensured that neither Rommel's beach defense nor von Rundstedt's mobile counterattack could function as designed. The tanks were too far from the beaches to stop the landings, but too restricted to concentrate for a decisive counterblow. Underlying all three failures was Hitler's refusal to delegate authority. The same leader who decreed that 1/12 of all construction materials should go to the strategically worthless Channel Islands also insisted on personally approving the release of every Panzer division. Frederick the Great, the Prussian monarch whom Hitler claimed to admire, once observed that he who defends everything defends nothing. The Atlantic Wall attempted to defend 2,000 miles of coastline against enemies with total air and naval supremacy. Its failure was not a matter of inadequate concrete or insufficient guns. It was a failure of strategic vision, a failure of command authority, a failure to recognize that in modern warfare, flexibility and speed matter more than fixed fortifications. The men who died defending the Atlantic Wall deserved better leadership than they received. The forced laborers who built the wall deserved not to have been enslaved in the first place. The Allied soldiers who stormed the beaches paid in blood for every advantage their enemies squandered. June 6, 1944 was not the longest day for Germany alone. It was the day that proved definitively that the Third Reich could not win the war it had started. The impregnable fortress crumbled in 24 hours, and the tide of history, held back so briefly by concrete and steel, resumed its inexorable flow toward Berlin,